Have you ever looked at your bank account at the end of the month and wondered where all the money went, despite feeling like you have been working harder than ever before and making what used to be considered a comfortable living? This is not a personal failure of discipline or a sudden inability to manage your finances, but rather the mathematical reality of a modern economic system that has fundamentally decoupled the cost of basic survival from the historical trajectory of wages. We are living in an era where the psychological burden of financial stagnation is often internalized as personal inadequacy, when in truth, the underlying mathematics of everyday life have been quietly rewritten over the past few decades to make the act of saving money an uphill battle against systemic forces. To understand why saving feels impossible today, we must look beyond the superficial advice of cutting out daily coffees or canceling streaming subscriptions and instead examine the profound structural shifts in how wealth is accumulated, how inflation silently erodes purchasing power, and how the modern environment is meticulously engineered to extract capital from the working class at every conceivable turn. The concept of saving money was historically built on a relatively straightforward mathematical premise, where a predictable portion of one's income could be reliably set aside after covering the essential costs of housing, food, and transportation. However, the modern economic landscape has transformed these basic necessities into luxury commodities, creating a baseline cost of living that consumes an unprecedented percentage of the average income before any discretionary spending even occurs. This shift has created a profound psychological dissonance, as the cultural narrative we inherited from previous generations still insists that hard work and frugality are the guaranteed pathways to financial security, while our lived experience demonstrates that these virtues are no longer mathematically sufficient to outpace the rising tide of expenses. When the gap between societal expectations and economic reality widens to this extent, it breeds a pervasive sense of financial anxiety and exhaustion, leading many individuals to experience a state of learned helplessness where the very act of trying to save feels like an exercise in futility. The psychological weight of this realization often triggers a defensive mechanism where people abandon long-term financial planning altogether, seeking immediate comfort in short-term consumption because the distant goal of true financial independence appears mathematically unattainable. If we break down the mathematics of modern living, the impossibility of saving becomes glaringly apparent through the disproportionate inflation of non-negotiable expenses compared to the stagnation of real wages. Consider the historical ratio of median home prices to median household income, which for decades hovered around a manageable multiple of 3, allowing a family to reasonably pay off a mortgage while simultaneously building a robust savings cushion. Today, that ratio has expanded dramatically in major economic centers, often requiring 5, 7, or even 10 times the median income to secure basic shelter, effectively transforming housing from a foundational asset into a lifelong financial drain that monopolizes the majority of a worker's productive output. When you combine this housing reality with the exponential increases in the costs of healthcare, education, and transportation, the mathematical equation of the average household budget simply breaks down, leaving a margin for savings that is either razor-thin or entirely non-existent. This is the silent math that governs our lives, a relentless arithmetic where the cost of merely existing increases at a compounding rate, while the compensation for our labor remains tethered to an outdated economic model that fails to account for the true cost of modern survival. Taking a broader system view, we can see that this mathematical squeeze is not an accidental byproduct of the economy, but rather a structural feature of a system that increasingly prioritizes the concentration of capital over the distribution of wealth. The modern financial ecosystem is designed to be highly efficient at extracting value from consumers through complex mechanisms such as subscription models, dynamic pricing, and the normalization of perpetual debt, all of which serve to transform what used to be one-time purchases into continuous streams of revenue for large corporations. This systemic extraction is further compounded by the invisible tax of inflation, which quietly diminishes the purchasing power of whatever small savings an individual manages to accumulate, effectively punishing those who attempt to hold on to their wealth in traditional bank accounts. In this environment, the traditional advice of simply saving a percentage of your income is mathematically flawed because the rate at which your saved capital loses its value often exceeds the rate at which you can accumulate it through labor alone. The system is inherently structured to require constant participation and continuous consumption, making the act of opting out and building independent wealth an act of profound resistance against the prevailing economic currents. To navigate this challenging landscape, there must be a fundamental identity shift in how we perceive our relationship with money, moving away from the passive role of a consumer trying to save scraps and toward the active role of a strategic allocator of resources. This requires acknowledging the harsh mathematical realities of the current system without succumbing to despair, and recognizing that while the traditional path to wealth may be broken, new frameworks for financial resilience can be constructed through intentional living and systemic awareness. It means redefining what constitutes a necessity, aggressively defending your attention against the sophisticated marketing machinery designed to manufacture artificial desires, and understanding that true financial freedom is not about accumulating endless consumer goods, but about buying back your own time and autonomy by shifting your identity from someone who is at the mercy of economic forces to someone who understands the underlying mechanics of the system. You can begin to make decisions that are aligned with mathematical reality rather than cultural conditioning, focusing your energy on acquiring assets that appreciate or generate value rather than simply trying to hoard depreciating currency. Ultimately, the realization that saving money feels impossible because the math is genuinely stacked against you should not be a source of discouragement, but rather a profound moment of liberation from the guilt and shame that so often accompany financial struggles. When you understand that you are operating within a system that has fundamentally changed the rules of the game, you can stop blaming yourself for not winning by the old rules and start developing a new strategy that is grounded in the realities of the modern economy. The path forward requires patience, systemic understanding, and a calm, methodical approach to building wealth that acknowledges